Good evening, everyone. With Kurt Davis, I'm Frank Camacho, and welcome to The 48. Lots to talk about this week. Baltimore has been dominating the headlines all week long, and I'd like to get your take on what you saw out there.
I just saw the good and the bad. You know, you saw the thugs who took advantage of the word protest and turned it into criminal activity. But you saw people also stand up to defend their neighborhoods, and you certainly saw a mother who opened up a can of whoop-ass on her son.
Yeah, Toya Graham.
Good for her.
Good for her, yeah, there she is. She's been dubbed the Mother of the Year. And it'd be nice if more parents took responsibility like she did.
But those are good messages that actually came out of Baltimore. After you got through the burning the cars and, you know, destroying people's property, you began to see people say, we're not going to have that kind of behavior going on in our city. That was, I thought, a good thing.
I think there's what we saw also was the culmination of so much frustration and so much distrust of the police department. And when you don't have a way to vent that anger, it does come out in inappropriate ways.
I guess, Frank, though, why is there anger now? You have an African American mayor, you have an African American police chief. Wait until the analysis is done, and who knows? There may be criminal charges. There may be. Why not wait until? I mean, what are you protesting?
But the fact that you have an African American mayor doesn't have anything to do with the police down on the street, and that's where the law is being enforced and where some of these abuses are happening.
And so you have people that I assume
you're not angry
and
at the
showed.
mayor. You're angry at the police.
Right, and it's being investigated. And why don't you want to find out until the investigation is done before? What are you protesting if you don't know what the conclusion is?
Do you really think? I mean, can you understand why some people would not trust that an investigation is going to come out with the appropriate findings or findings that they
Not
feel?
until I know what the outcome is.
Yeah, but you look
It's
at...
a little jump in the gun, I guess, is what
Well,
I'm saying.
I mean, you kind of look at Ferguson, you kind of look at the situation
But Ferguson's
in New
not
York.
Baltimore.
Yeah, but you look at all these other different examples all over the country.
I mean, you have to wait until the facts come out and then determine if you're upset with what happens then.
Understood, but what I'm saying...
Peaceful protest is certainly an absolute right.
Understood, but do you understand how some people can get frustrated with that?
Not until after until the conclusion. No, I don't understand.
Okay, yeah, well, people do get frustrated. There is a lack of trust in the system. And when you look at some of the facts behind it,
I'm sure there's a lot of very good officers involved.
Oh, yeah, there's some very good officers. I mean, I'm not taking sides in this. I'm just saying I can understand both sides. And I'm like you. I mean, I would like for them to complete this investigation as quickly as possible, but what I would like for them to do is to get it right. Yeah. That's the important thing.
And we'll know probably next week.
Right? Let's hope so, because it's going from the Baltimore PD has completed its investigation. They've sent it to the Attorney General's office, and we'll see what happens.
Hillary's got trouble again.
Oh gosh, does she ever?
Another.
It's one thing after the other with these folks.
And I think it's a real problem for her because it creates a narrative about yesterday. You know, brings back Whitewater and all the things we forgot about. And here we go again. We have, you know, over 1,000 donations that they didn't even report related to this foundation.
Oops.
And, yeah, well, and the argument is, oh, it happens all the time. Well, it doesn't get to happen all the time when you're running for president, and it's your foundation, and it smells.
Yeah, I have to say that I probably agree with you that it does smell a little bit, but by the same token.
So it opened the door for Bernie Sanders.
Oh, Bernie, it's going to be very interesting with what he has to. What I'm most interested in is the fact he's decided to run as a Democrat, as opposed to just an independent.
And that's too bad. I think it'd be better if he, sorry about that, if he ran as a socialist or an independent.
We make a great pair, don't we? I mean, I've got a cold and you can barely talk. I mean, it's amazing.
It'd be great if he ran for what he is. And let American people hear what his message is.
I have to agree with you as well. I think that Bernie should just go out there and stand on his own 2 feet. I think he would do quite, it would be interesting. I don't think he'd win, but I think it would be interesting.
John Anderson did that, you know, back in the, during the Reagan's first run.
Right, right. And I think a lot of times what happens here is that it gives the electorate something. It changes the whole dynamics of what is being talked about and how it's being talked about. And I think American people need to hear a lot of that stuff.
Right. Anything going on locally?
Interesting. I heard I guess our PIOS team is wondering if Judge Snow overstepped his authority. I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what they're talking about, but it seems like that's just you're flogging a dead horse here. I mean,
Well, and there was a good story about the judge who appointed the judge, basically his political credentials, which clearly are not from left of center. He was appointed by Republican administrations to his different judgeships. And it was kind of interesting. Now we're starting to get into the analysis of who the judge is and all of that. But it is a factor in these kinds of cases because you can't just point the finger and say, oh, it's a liberal judge. He's not a liberal judge.
he's a good judge. I mean, he's looking at the law, at least in my estimation. And from my days of covering a lot of his cases, I think he's well thought of, Judge Snow is.
So 2% of young people in this country think the media will do the right thing. That's a scary statistic.
That
for
is
the long
very
term.
scary. That is long term. That is very scary. And we need to get into that. And one of these, I think we're going to do a program on that because
Yeah,
that really
be
does
fun.
need, we need to talk about it. When we come back on the 48th, we'll talk about bacterial weaponry, American society, and
Scary stuff.
very scary stuff. And we have one of the leading experts in the country right here in Arizona. You'll meet him when the 48th continues.
Welcome back, and we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Paul Keim with us. Dr. Keim is both at NAU and with TGen. He's got 2 assignments, but he's also known as Dr. Anthrax. Tell us a little bit about some of the things you've worked on over the years that have meant a lot to our country.
Well, I'm a DNA expert, and it just happens I work on things like anthrax. So when we think about DNA and the Human Genome Project, you can kind of think of I'm doing the Human Genome Project, but I'm doing it on things like anthrax or the superbugs. So I work on the DNA of those organisms, trying to develop better diagnostics. We want to develop better drugs to treat these superbugs, and we also use it to track down where diseases come from.
So let's talk about that. Let's go back a number of years. There was a terrorist cult in Japan years ago that was involved in some famous attacks. Tell us about your involvement. I know you were involved in solving that mystery.
Well, the Aum Shinrikyo was a doomsday cult, and so what they wanted to do is create societal chaos. And they were going to do this by carrying out attacks, biological weapons attacks, chemical attacks, and then create chaos so that they could step into the vacuum and take over. And they had this guy, Ashihara, who was their cult leader, and he had this Manson-type control over his followers. So one of the things they did was they carried out an anthrax attack in Tokyo. They went up on the top of a 6-story building and they sprayed anthrax out over the city. And the neighbors complained because it smelled. But nobody died and nobody even got sick. It was just this complaint. And it took a few years, and then they came to me and said, why did this fail? And it turned out that they were using a type of anthrax that doesn't kill people. And so the cult was incompetent. Unfortunately, a couple of years later, they did carry out a chemical attack in the subways, and a lot of people got sick and a few people died.
So you were able, through DNA sequencing, to determine what they used and who might have been involved in it or where it was produced?
Yeah, so we were the Anthrax Genome Project, and what we discovered was that they had taken a vaccine strain for animals and they tried to weaponize it. If you're trying to kill people, it's a bad strategy.
How serious a threat is chemical warfare?
Well, it is a threat, and a lot of the threat is really, again, this chaos, or how do we create problems? A lot of people die in the United States every year from auto accidents, or unfortunately from hospital-acquired illnesses, diseases. And so one of the biggest threats is that it would be disruptive to our society and our culture, more so than the number of people that would die.
So you're saying it would be the chaos it would create as opposed to the actual ingestion and death?
Yeah, unfortunately, people could and would probably die in a successful attack like this, but you know, the fear factor associated with biological weapons is tremendous.
So let's fast forward. We had anthrax attacks in the United States, and again, I know you were heavily involved in determining the who, what, the why, and where. Tell us a little bit about that, because that was a fear
It was.
situation in our nation's capital.
And the environment, just like the Amshinrikyo, when right in the days following 9/11, you know, that we were all stunned, you know, by what had happened in New York and Washington. Someone started sending letters out to different folks in the media and also to governmental officials, and these letters were filled with anthrax spores. And so, you know, in the end, unfortunately, 5 people died and 22 got sick, got anthrax from this. But the fear and the disruption associated with that were much bigger than those unfortunate deaths. And so everybody was, you know, microwaving their mail and things like that. And microwaving is not a good way to kill anthrax, by the way. And so this was incredibly disruptive.
How did you go about determining who the perpetrator was and all that? And what happened?
Yeah, so it took us 5 years to track down the person who actually sent those letters. But the way that we did it is by using, again, DNA analysis to do what we call traceback or source analysis. It's a forensic approach to identifying the source of a deadly pathogen, in this case anthrax. So what we did we became, at NAU, we became the repository of evidence for the FBI. They started subpoenaing folks all across the United States, and we ended up with over 1,000 pieces of evidence in our laboratory. And we would go in and we'd do the DNA typing, the fingerprinting on all of that evidence, putting together the puzzle, what was in the letters, what was in the repository from across the United States, and we started to narrow in on one part of that repository. And that one little place where it intersected, where the letters intersected with the repository and the evidence, was this U.S. Army facility in Maryland. So then we have this facility with you know, thousands of pieces of anthrax, and we went in even deeper and went into their facility and identified the exact flask that the spores came out of.
The exact flask.
The exact flask. RMR 1029 was the number.
And who had contact with it?
That's right. And so at that point then the DNA analysis was done, and it really came down to the traditional forensic investigative things that the FBI would do. And so they made a list of all the people who had access to that. They certainly knew who had ready access to it. They started looking at those people, asking where were they when the letters were mailed. They had figured out where the letters were mailed from, which was in New Jersey, which is only a couple hours drive from this laboratory in Maryland. And so then they started going down the list, and you know, some people had good alibis and some people didn't. And
Ultimately, didn't the person that they had under review end up taking their own life? Or?
That's right. And so it was about 6 weeks before this person committed suicide. The FBI came to me, and I had no idea who they were investigating, and they started asking me, you know, I knew this person. I knew him very well, and they started asking me, when had I told him that we were on to the case, and when had we made these big scientific advances, and when had we narrowed it down to a single flask? Who had I told? And they wanted to know the exact timeline because they were matching that timeline of information up against his activities.
Okay. So we're talking about reactive. What about proactive? And we'll discuss that when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back, and our guest tonight is Mr. Dr. Paul Keim from TGen and Dr. Anthrax, and we're talking about bacterial attacks on the United States. And as we were mentioning before the break, you're giving us examples of how you're reacting. What about proactive? I mean, how can we defend the country against these kinds of attacks?
Well, there's a lot of different strategies, and some of them have to do with international cooperation and treaties. And so we got into this business originally to track anthrax strains around the globe. And so we went out of our way to find out what the Soviet Union, for example, was using. We know that the Soviets developed a very extensive biological weapons program, and they were keeping it very secret, but they produced some 2,000 tons of anthrax spores. Oof. And we have the DNA fingerprint for that strain. And so if that strain got distributed to Iraq or Iran or other countries like that, we now have the evidence for that. That's a very daunting thing for a country. They do not want to go out and create a crime if it's not going to be anonymous. And so we try to make this transparent. We make sure that our information that we know is public. Again, so it's kind of a psychological way that we can prevent them from going forward with this.
Fingerprints, discuss that, describe that. What do you mean by fingerprints?
Yeah, so a fingerprint we think of as a unique identifier, Frank. So you've left your fingerprints all over this table.
Right.
If you had anthrax, we would know that it was yours. So don't do that. No, just joking, of course. But the anthrax also has a DNA signature that is very unique to it, and it changes over time. And so if you would take anthrax and you give it to Kurt, I would be able to tell that Kurt's anthrax wasn't yours, but I could tell that it came from you. And so this fingerprint is a way to trace things back. And it's a process of genetics. We use genetic principles that we teach at NAU. It's a great place to go to school, I would say.
Go Jacks.
Go Jacks, yes. And so those principles, those basic principles, are in this case very applied to this problem of traceback.
So is that the way you keep other countries in line, because of they know that you know that you can find their fingerprint? Exactly.
And so there's consequences, big international consequences, if somebody breaks a treaty. And we want to make sure that we know as much as we can about different types of anthrax. For example, in the Iraqi war, we obtained anthrax that the Iraqis were using their biological weapons program. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things we asked was, did they get it from the Soviets? Were they collaborating with the Soviets? And it turns out they weren't. And so their program was independent of the Soviet program, at least based upon this evidence.
Let's go. I know there's things you can talk about and things you can't talk about because of the work you do for the federal government. Anthrax, you've sometimes, I know, have described as not, it's a hit or miss, or not always the perfect weapon to use. I know there's other. What are the really bad bugs that are out there?
Yeah, so the ones that we worry about the most would be anthrax is probably the number one. Number two would be smallpox. Smallpox is a virus. It's highly regulated. It only exists that we know of in two places in the world. One's in our federal government and the other one's in the Russian federal government now. And so that's a second one that was widely weaponized. More common ones that we have here in Arizona would be plague, the Black Death. Mm-hmm. That's one that was weaponized by a number of countries. Tularemia, another one that occurs naturally in Arizona. So there's a lot of diseases that have been turned into weapons historically, and so we have developed these DNA fingerprint databases for all of those as a preventative mechanism to prevent governments from going out and thinking they can get away with something and we won't know it. We will. We'll figure it out.
How vulnerable are we?
Well, again, it's this fear factor, the sensational. I think that we have a great healthcare system in the United States that would respond very quickly to this. We saw initial, some panic and some chaos when Ebola came into Texas, for example, but then we responded and things got under control. So there'll be, in something that's unexpected, you can anticipate that there are going to be problems initially. But we really do have a great infrastructure in the United States to take care of these things, and so I think we'll respond quickly. And
scary movies don't help either.
No, it doesn't. The zombie movies, for example. Yeah, I'm scared of zombies.
Now, we've talked about the bad side of the things that you work on in your lab. I know there's many good things you work on your lab. Give us a couple of things where you're actually transforming healthcare.
Yeah, exactly like tracking back the anthrax. One of the things we're doing now is looking at hospital systems. Unfortunately, there are over 1 million hospital-acquired infections every year in the United States. 1 million. Okay, so those people are going in for, say, a joint replacement, a knee or hip, and they end up with what we call a MRSA infection. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they get those from the hospital. These DNA trace-back mechanisms. These DNA fingerprinting methods we used on anthrax can be used on these superbugs like MRSA. And so we can figure out if you got that infection from the surgical suite, from one of the instruments that was used, or perhaps from one of the healthcare workers. And of course, this isn't to point the finger and send somebody to jail, but it's to prevent it from ever happening again.
Okay, so you can find the source. What about the treatment of the MRSA?
So there is definitely a lack of antibiotics on the scene right now. And so the drug companies are not turning these out like they used to. There's some really interesting market forces involved with antibiotics. You know, HIV, hepatitis C, these are diseases that are chronic diseases, and there was a great economic motivator for drug companies to develop those because they had a patient for life, basically. Whereas if you get a MRSA infection and we cure you, you're a patient for 10 days. And so you can see the economic forces there that are involved. And so there's a lack of good drugs to treat these antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And so preventing them is really one of our best strategies. And if we can identify how you're obtaining that, we can go back and we can eliminate that source.
Well, Frank, I think we could talk about this
Oh, we
for
could.
hours, and I want
Exactly.
to thank you, Dr. Keim, for taking the time, and you
You're
truly
welcome.
are an Arizona treasure to have in
Thanks,
our
Frank.
state.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And we invite you to come back.
Excellent.
Okay.
Excellent.
And we'll be right back. I'd like to thank Dr. Paul Keim once again. Fascinating guest, very interesting topics. Also, we'd like to hear from you. If you have any questions, any comments, just go ahead and email us. We'd love to hear from you. Next week, we have one of the old-time good guys of Arizona politics.
The guy that should have been governor.
Many years ago. Leo Corbett will join us to talk about the political scene then and now, and also a new endeavor that he's very much involved in. We invite you to join us then.